Imagine growing up in a house built by cypress and brick, yet knowing nothing but the total darkness behind shuttered windows. That was the world of Elizabeth Vance, the blind daughter of one of North Carolina's wealthiest, yet failing families, somewhere between the tobacco fields of eastern Carolina and the Cape Fear River. There existed a plantation called Hollowest, a place local records deliberately obscured for over a century, between 1839 and 1857. 11 men disappeared from its quarters without explanation, but the true horror began in 1856, when something was born in that house that made wealthy collectors from 3 states travel in secret, carrying bags of gold coins they'd never acknowledge. The child's existence was buried in falsified birth records and encrypted letters, a conspiracy accidentally exposed by a courthouse fire in 1923. Before we continue with the story of the Vance family legacy, if you're fascinated by true historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and terrifying possibility, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not what was recorded, but what was systematically erased, and why an entire community chose silence over justice. Hollowest Plantation sat on exhausted soil in Duplin County, North Carolina. By 1839, the grand 3-story house, built for prosperity, reflected only diminishing returns. The plantation was collapsing under debt, the consequences of depleted soil, and the stubborn failures of its owner, Nathaniel Vance. Nathaniel maintained an expensive appearance, wearing tailored coats he hadn't paid for and polishing boots worn by an enslaved man he hadn't yet sold. In just 5 years, he had sold more than half of the people he enslaved to cover debts, selling families and scattering them across the eastern counties. Elizabeth's mother, Margaret, died just 18 months after her birth in 1827, having taken an overdose of laudanum. Nathaniel raised Elizabeth in near isolation, confining her primarily to the shuttered second floor. Her world was 17 rooms and a narrow set of stairs, where she learned to navigate by touch and sound. An enslaved woman named Ada taught the girl to read in secret, carving raised letters into wooden blocks. Defying Nathaniel's minimal education policy. Year by year, the plantation's financial situation worsened. By 1838, foreclosure was looming. Nathaniel's blind, unmarriageable daughter represented only an expense, and there would be nothing for her to inherit. It was during a whiskey-soaked night, reviewing his late father's papers, that Nathaniel discovered a legal precedent from 1791, a technical interpretation of North Carolina law regarding property classification. His daughter Elizabeth was free and white by birth, but he realized that if she were to bear a child, and if that child's paternity could be documented in a specific, legally technical way, that child could be classified not as his grandchild, but as valuable property of the estate. This was a calculation so monstrous, so desperate, that it was only possible because of the immense debt that threatened to swallow his entire legacy. He knew there existed a hidden market for enslaved people with specific characteristics, and he had just found a horrifying way to create the ultimate commodity. Light-skinned children, particularly those with documented European ancestry, commanded premium prices. They were status symbols, purchased as evidence of wealth and taste. The more unusual the circumstances of their birth, the higher the price. A child born to a blind white woman with carefully documented mixed parentage would be extraordinarily attractive enough to buyers willing to pay in gold. Nathaniel sat in his study until dawn, working through the legal mechanics. He needed several years to execute the plan before foreclosure. He needed to document everything correctly, secure physicians and magistrates to sign the right papers, and select the men carefully, choosing traits that would make the eventual child valuable. He decided to save his estate through the one asset everyone believed was worthless, his blind daughter, Elizabeth. What he planned was simply an extension of the monstrous moral calculus of slavery applied to his own bloodline, It was by the twisted reasoning of the time. Technically legal. Nathaniel began writing letters to 3 men he knew were drowning in debt and would see an opportunity where others saw horror. The first letter went to Dr. Ephraim Stokes, the county physician and coroner, who was heavily in debt and the only doctor authorized to sign the necessary certificates. The letter hinted at generous, guaranteed compensation for professional documentation. The second went to Magistrate Calvin Pritchard, who had accumulated gambling debts in Wilmington. Nathaniel mentioned a complex legal matter regarding property law, subtly using Pritchard's debt as leverage. The third went to Thomas Harrington, a brokerage specializing in the sale of enslaved people. This letter was more direct. Nathaniel wrote he would soon have a unique acquisition that would attract serious collectors, guaranteeing high profit. Harrington immediately understood, replying in code that he had 3 potential buyers already in mind. Stokes arrived first. After a 3-hour secretive meeting, he left with a promissory note for $500, agreeing to the medical documentation protocols. Pritchard arrived next, after dark. Their nearly 5-hour meetings secured the complex legal mechanisms, property classification, and filing requirements. Pritchard left with a promissory note for $800 and Nathaniel's explicit promise to settle his Wilmington gambling debts. The conspiracy was secured. Nathaniel then turned to his most delicate asset, Elizabeth. He changed her routine, forcing her to come downstairs for meals once a week. The terrified girl, guided by the enslaved woman Ada, slowly learned the count: 16 steps down, turn left, 12 paces to the dining room door. During these meals, Nathaniel spoke of family duty and preserving their legacy, conditioning her to obey his unspoken plans. In May 1839, Nathaniel began selecting the men. He reviewed the enslaved population with the cold calculation of breeding livestock, looking for specific physical characteristics: height, symmetrical features, and lighter skin tones. The first man selected was Jacob, 24, tall, strongly built, with lighter skin and features suggesting mixed ancestry. His father was a white overseer. Jacob, who could secretly read and write, was immediately suspicious when moved from the field quarters to a small room in the main house, but he had no choice but to obey. The second man was Daniel, 19, quick and intelligent, who worked in the stables. His light eyes and straight hair suggested European ancestry somewhere in his bloodline. Nathaniel was preparing his house, his daughter, and his assets for a systematic, monstrous experiment that was designed to save his wealth and secure the ultimate commodity. Nathaniel selected 9 more enslaved men over the following weeks, rotating them into various household positions, isolating all 11 from the remaining plantation population. They were young, strong, and treated with unusual care, causing the others at Hollowest to whisper, Master Vance was planning something. It would not be good. Over the next few years, Nathaniel refined his legal documentation with Magistrate Pritchard. They reviewed the property classification statutes and prepared falsified versions of Elizabeth's birth certificate, designed to replace the accurate ones in county records, suggesting she was born to an enslaved mother. Dr. Stokes continued his clinical examinations of Elizabeth, confirming the plan would begin when she reached physical maturity in her late teens. Elizabeth, confined to the 2nd floor, remained tragically unaware of the conspiracy developing around her. The elaborate fiction rested on the horrific truth of the law. Enslaved status followed the mother's condition. If Nathaniel could successfully create documentation suggesting Elizabeth herself was enslaved, her child would automatically be born into slavery, making them legally acquirable property. Pritchard, motivated by debt, worked alone, crafting an unbreakable legal chain of property registration and ownership transfers, ensuring the lie was elegant in its deception. Meanwhile, Thomas Harrington cultivated his buyers, sending coded letters describing a unique acquisition with mixed ancestry and extraordinary birth circumstances. promising to notify them the moment the commodity was available. Ada, the enslaved woman caring for Elizabeth, understood enough from overheard fragments to be terrified. Nathaniel's threat to sell her to a turpentine camp, where women rarely survived 2 years, was sufficient to ensure her silence, though not her cooperation. She could not stop what was coming, but privately vowed to help Elizabeth survive it. Elizabeth turned 18 in the winter of 1845. The merchant bank had given Nathaniel until January 1846 to pay his debt. The timeline was tight. In the spring of 1845, Dr. Stokes certified Elizabeth was physically capable of pregnancy. The following months were a systematic violation of human dignity. Nathaniel executed his plan with cold precision. The 11 selected men were brought into situations they could not refuse under threat of violence or death, and Elizabeth, blind and isolated, had no power to resist her father's control. The details were those of calculated exploitation, executed with the systematic efficiency of a business transaction. By July 1845, Dr. Stokes confirmed Elizabeth was pregnant. The plan shifted to its next phase, maintaining the pregnancy, preparing for birth, and finalizing the legal documents. Nathaniel treated the pregnancy purely as a business matter. Pritchard finalized the falsified documentation, creating a complete backstory where Elizabeth was actually the daughter of an enslaved woman named Sarah. The real birth certificate was removed and replaced, legally designating Elizabeth herself as enslaved, thus guaranteeing her child would be born into bondage. In November 1845, the conspiracy faced an unexpected threat. Reverend Thomas Gaines, the local minister, arrived unannounced at Hollowest. Gaines, having heard rumors, asked to visit Elizabeth to offer prayer and comfort. Nathaniel's mind raced. Elizabeth was now visibly pregnant. He carefully refused, claiming she was too ill and the doctor had ordered complete quiet. The Reverend, sensing something amiss, pressed gently, his quiet suspicion threatening to unravel the entire fragile, monstrous plan. Nathaniel remained firm, and Reverend Gaines left, troubled but unwilling to investigate a wealthy man's private household. Winter arrived. On March 4, 1846, after a difficult 20-hour labor, Elizabeth gave birth to a son. The child was healthy, with features that clearly showed the calculated mixed ancestry Nathaniel desired. Valuable. Elizabeth, exhausted, was denied her request to hold her newborn. The child was taken immediately for documentation. Ada, watching, felt something inside her break permanently. Dr. Stokes carried the infant downstairs to Nathaniel's study, where Magistrate Pritchard was waiting. The birth certificate was immediately filled out and signed by both men, now legally stating, child born to Sarah, enslaved woman, deceased, father unknown, property of Nathaniel Vance. The child was named Thomas, with no surname. Nathaniel immediately contacted Thomas Harrington. The bidding began at $3,000 and quickly rose to $4,700, more than enough to pay off the merchant bank and save Hollowest. The buyer was Charles Ruddled, a wealthy sugar planter from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, known for collecting unusual human acquisitions to serve as display pieces in his household. Ruddled arrived on April 17th. Nathaniel presented Thomas, lying in his crib, for inspection. Ruddled examined him with the detachment of someone evaluating livestock. Nathaniel presented the falsified birth certificate, confirming the child was legally enslaved property from birth. Ruddled asked no questions that would expose the lies. Discretion was essential in such transactions. The sale was completed within 2 hours. Ruddled's servants counted out $4,700 in gold coins. Rebecca, the wet nurse, kissed the baby's forehead before handing him over. Upstairs, Elizabeth heard the commotion of the carriage departing. Ada came to her and confirmed, "They are taking the baby away. You will never see him again." Elizabeth, who had not even been permitted to hold her son once, realized the full, crushing extent of the calculated business transaction. Nathaniel used the gold to pay off the Wilmington Bank, saving his estate. However, the conspiracy had left too many traumatized witnesses. 8 months after the sale, in December 1846, Isaac, one of the 11 men, attempted to end his own life, unable to reconcile what he had been forced to do. Nathaniel punished him, then sold him to a Virginia plantation, eliminating a witness but spreading the terrible secret elsewhere. Ada became withdrawn, crushed by the weight of her helplessness. In March 1847, exactly 1 year after Thomas's birth, Elizabeth's psychological state deteriorated sharply into what Dr. Stokes diagnosed as nervous hysteria. She suffered screaming episodes, refused food, and retreated into herself. Stokes's only treatment was laudanum and confinement, keeping her sedated but never healing the trauma. The constant supervision meant more people were aware something was deeply wrong. In June 1847, Reverend Gaines made another attempt to visit Elizabeth. Nathaniel was away, and Ada, exhausted and desperate, let him in. Gaines found Elizabeth sedated and fragile, slowly, disjointedly, confused by trauma and medication. Elizabeth spoke fragments of what had happened: the confinement, her father's plans, the men brought to her room, the child taken away. Gaines understood enough to be horrified. When Nathaniel returned and found Gaines waiting, he felt cold fear. He immediately claimed Elizabeth was severely ill and that her mind creates fictions. Gaines left, deeply troubled and unsatisfied. The fragile silence of the conspiracy was now truly broken. Reverend Gaines began asking discreet questions in Kennonville about the Vance family and the sudden, large gold payment that saved Hollowest from foreclosure. He went to Magistrate Pritchard and expressed his concerns about unusual property transfers. Pritchard, whose own debts were paid with Nathaniel's gold, firmly assured the Reverend that everything was entirely proper and legally documented, warning him that continued inquiry would be seen as harassment. Gaines understood the threat. He had no legal authority or allies willing to challenge the county's power structure. He recorded his suspicions in a private journal, but took no further action. The conspiracy held because everyone with power had motivation to protect it. Stokes, Pritchard, and Harrington were paid off and complicit in fraud. Ruddle owned a child whose purchase was only legitimate if the fraud remained hidden, and the victims Elizabeth and the enslaved people had no voice in a system that systematically denied them legal standing. Years passed. Elizabeth remained confined, medicated, and broken. Ada grew old, carrying the crushing burden of witness. The 11 men were gradually sold away, their knowledge disconnected. By 1850, Hollowest was financially stable. Nathaniel maintained a respectable facade. The truth buried in falsified documents and the silence of conspirators thought the truth might have stayed buried forever, if not for a fire that destroyed the Duplin County Courthouse in Kennonville on October 14, 1923, years after Thomas's birth. During the cleanup, workers discovered something strange: 2 contradictory birth certificates for Elizabeth Vance, both dated 1827. One was accurate. The other claimed her mother was Sarah, enslaved woman, deceased. Local historian Harold Jensen investigated the mystery, discovering the 1846 bill of sale for the infant Thomas, a child whose birth certificate listed the same fictional mother, Sarah. As Jensen dug deeper, he uncovered the web of inconsistencies: the suspicious legal filings by Pritchard, the medical records signed by Stokes. His findings, published in 1924, suggested deliberate documentary fraud, used to sell a child for profit. The case was strengthened in 1931 with the discovery of Reverend Gaines's private journal, which detailed his visits to Elizabeth and his suspicions. In 1947, a descendant of Ada located a collection of her unpublished letters. In painful detail, Ada described the entire horror. That child was born innocent into a system that made him property, and his own grandfather sold him for gold. Historians now largely accept the accuracy of the story. Nathaniel Vance orchestrated a conspiracy involving a physician, a magistrate, and a broker to exploit his blind daughter, fraudulently classifying her child as enslaved property to save his estate from foreclosure. Elizabeth Vance died on November 3, 1863, at age 36, having spent the last 17 years confined and psychologically destroyed. Ada's letters suggest Elizabeth chose release, simply stopping eating and drinking. Nathaniel Vance survived until 1871, dying at age 79 in his study. A half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him, still calculating profits and losses until his final moments. He never faced legal consequences. The conspirators, Stokes, Pritchard, and Harrington all died. But the silence they maintained was powerful enough to ensure the truth remained hidden for decades. Ada lived until 1882, surviving the end of slavery, but forever haunted by her powerlessness. As for Thomas, the child sold for gold in 1846, his fate is unknown. He may have escaped during the Civil War chaos, or lived a long life in freedom. Never knowing the truth about his birthright, Hollowest Plantation is now a ruin, the main house long collapsed. The story of what occurred there between 1839 and 1846 represents a disturbing documented case of how the legal framework of slavery could be manipulated to commit atrocities that were technically legal within their historical context. It reveals the profound powerlessness of victims and how systems of oppression can be exploited by the greedy and the desperate. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in Duplin County's soil? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think. If you found this historical investigation compelling and disturbing, subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into America's darkest secrets. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that horror is not always supernatural. Sometimes the real monsters are human, and the real terror comes from systems that allow them to operate with impunity.